Let's have a walkthrough of the DropThings code base. Let me show you how the execution flows through different parts of the DropThings whenever you load the site and visit the home page. So the first page that hits is the default ASPX. So let's start from there. So on the default ASPX, we have a couple of events that ASP.NET fires first. The first one is the onInit one. So inside this event, nothing much happens. It basically does some logging and verification that whether we are getting too much request from some particular client or not. So this is used to do kind of a prevention of denial of service attacks. So it's not something significant. The most important thing is that then the create child controls happens. So this is the event that ASP.NET fires whenever the page controls are being created. So if you dynamically create something on your page, then this is the event where you should be doing that. Since the DropThings widgets are all created dynamically, so they need to be created here. Otherwise, those controls will not get the view states or will not get the events fired. So what happens here is that first it calls this function, create best child control. It basically fires the ASP.NET create child control event to do its job. So that creates the page layout, the header area, the footer area, everything that you have defined in the markup of the default ASPX, the HTML markup of the default ASPX. So all these things get created when you call that base.createChildControls. Once that's done, we need to load the current user setup. So this function takes care of loading the current user setup. So what it first does is that it gets the business facade instance. So this facade class contains all the business functions. Then it checks if the current user is an anonymous user, and if it's the first visit, then it calls this first visit home tab. So this takes care of creating the default tabs, then the default widgets, and setting up the user account and all these things. This is done in the first visit home tab. If it is not first visit, then it's a repeated visit for an anonymous user. So in that case, it just loads whatever tab setting is there. If it is not an anonymous user, if it's a login user, then it's the same way it does the repeat visit, but it passes the logged in username. So this way the right user space setting is loaded. And this is one of the fallback option. If for some reason the user's pages are lost or something like that, then it will simulate a first visit for that user. And finally, it updates the ASP.NET profile, stores the last login date time. Then it marks that it's no longer the first visit. The next visit will be a second visit or something like that. And then it saves the profile. So that's how the user's page setup gets created, or if there is an existing page setup, it gets loaded. Then the next event would be the setup tab control panel. This is what called next. This basically takes care of setting up the control panel area of the tab. So by control panel, we mean where you can click the add stuff or you can change the tab setting. So looking at the current user, it loads the right widgets there. So just basically setting up the add stuff and change setting area. Then the next one should be, let's see, we are in create child controls. So next one is the user tab bar. So this loads the tabs of the current user. So it takes the current user ID and the tab collection and then renders the tabs of the user. And then finally the widget tab host, which is the 3-column area where you see all the widgets that are loaded. It calls it load widgets, passes the current tab, and then the name of the container control. And this name is basically the widget container.ascx. So it knows that for each and every widget we need to use this container. And then this takes care of creating the columns on the tab, and then loading the widgets inside those columns, and then activating those widgets. Everything is taken care of by this widget tab host for these widgets, for all the widgets on the page. And then this is something that we just looked at. Basically, this is the add stuff area and the change settings area. So that's all happens during the initialization of the default ASPX. And once this completes, it basically gets everything done. You can see the tabs, you can see the widgets inside the tab. All the columns are there, widget drag and drop, everything is set up and ready to go. And if you look at the other functions in the default ASPX, so this is an event on reload page. So sometimes the page needs to be reloaded. For example, whenever you add a new tab or you switch tab, the page needs to be reloaded. So then this event gets fired. This basically does nothing but calling the widget tab host.load widgets again, so that the widgets are loaded again for the current tab. Then if a new tab is added, then it passes under this event, when a new widget is added, it just calls the widget tab host.add new widget, and that takes care of adding a new widget and then showing it on the right column. So that's it on the default ASPX. So if you go to the facade and see what happens during the first visit and the second visit, so let's go through those. So this is where if the user is anonymous and is the first visit, then it calls first visit home tab. So if you go to this function, so here it gets the template user. By template user, I mean there is a certain user that is used as a template user, and all the tabs and all the widgets that is defined in that specific user is copied for every single new user. So when the clone anon profile is enabled, that means that there is a user that we need to use as a template and clone that particular user's tabs and widgets and for the new user who has just visited. So then we get the tabs of that user. So it basically gets all the template tabs, and then for each tab it clones the tab. So during the cloning process, it creates one tab for every template tab on the current user, and then inside that tab it will go and create the columns, and then eventually the widget zones, and then the widgets. All of this will happen inside the clone tab. Then if the template user has defined some tabs as shared tab, by shared tab it means that user can get those tabs as a read-only view. So what happens is that when your user visits, all the tabs of a template user is cloned, but there are tabs which are not cloned. Those tabs are shown as read-only. So this is handy when you want to create a couple of tabs where you will put some read-only widgets that each and every user cannot customize. So then it gets all those logged tabs which the new user can only see in a read-only mode. So that goes to user shared tabs. And then finally checks whether the current user who is logged in is really that template user. So in that case, you need to allow that user to change all the tabs. Otherwise, it will not allow to change all the tabs, because only template user can change template user tabs. The new users will not be able to change them. And that's it. Basically, this takes care of creating all these tabs. And in case there was no template user setup, then it will create some default tabs and create some default widget randomly looking at the widget table definition, and those tabs will be given to the new user. So finally it collects all these responses. It gets the tabs of the new user, then gets the setting, decides what's the current tab to show, the current user ID, and returns the response. And this response is used to render the presentation. So that's the first visit, when user had nothing. Everything is created from scratch. When user has come back again, then the repeat visit home tab is called. So in that case, very simple. Just get the tabs of the current user. If the tabs are found, then it will just load all of these into the response object and then just return that response object. And then the rendering takes care of rendering those tabs and widgets and everything. And in case the user had no pages, no tabs, or it was lost for some reason, then it will simulate the first visit experience again. So that's basically the code execution flow when a user goes to the DraftThings website, either as a brand new anonymous user or as an existing user, or either as a logged in user. These two functions, first visit home tab and repeat visit home tab, takes care of all these scenarios. Now we looked at what happens at the business layer. So let's take a look at what happens on the UI layer, how the code flows through the default ASPX and then the user controls, and eventually how all this rendering happens. If you go back to default ASPX, so once the default ASPX code execution completes, basically it calls the user tab bar the load tabs. So if you go to the tab bar and look at the code, so let's go to the load tabs function. So here it takes all of this input from the default ASPX was the current user, the tabs collection, and then it renders those tabs one by one. So here it loops through the tabs, and then for each tab it creates these list items and then some div and span to render those tabs. So the tab is very easy. You can go through this code and see there are a couple of logics there, here and there. But the complex thing is the widget tab host. So if you go to the load widgets function, so let's go to load widgets. Okay. So first it calls the setup widget zones. So let me take you to the DropThings website and show you what the zones are. So on the DropThings website, we have 3 columns. So each column has a couple of widgets there. So what is there is that in each column there is a widget instance zone that lists all these widgets. So there are 3 widget instance zone, 1 per column, and each widget instance zone has several widgets inside it. So what it does is it first creates the widget zones. So first it goes through all the columns, and for each column it creates one widget zone control. So widget instance zone is this control, and then it basically adds those widget zones inside the column update panels. So each column is an update panel. So if we go to the UI, so each column has an update panel, and inside the update panel we are loading one widget instance zone. Okay, and once the widget instance zones are created, then widget instance zones takes care of loading the widgets inside it. So if we go to the widget instance zone, and here is the load widgets function, so it will take care of loading the widgets inside the widget instance zone. So now we are inside a single widget instance zone. That means that we are inside a particular column. See, this column has 1, 2, 3 widgets. So what it will do is that it will load the widget instances on this particular widget zone. So by a widget zone we mean on a tab on a certain column, and it will first delete this the widget controls in case they are already created before. So this happens when you are in a postback scenario. First the page setup is loaded as it was before, then some event fires, and because of the event fire you will have to recreate the widget controls again. So when you recreate it, it first needs to remove all these widgets control first and then recreates it. So assume that this is not the postback scenario, so this loop basically does nothing. It finds no widget control there, and thus it skips. Then it goes through each and every widget instance, which basically means an instance of a widget. By instance of a widget we mean this is an widget instance, this is an widget instance, this is an widget instance. So this is an instance of RSS widget, and this is an instance of RSS widget again, and this is one instance of a Twitter widget. So it will go through each of the widget instance, and then it will create a widget container from widget instance. So widget container is this control. As you know that widget container is basically this whole box. You have the header area, the body area, all these buttons, these are inside the widget container. But what you see inside this white body area is the actual widget control, which is dynamically loaded inside the widget container. So here it basically going to create a widget container from this particular widget instance. So it basically dynamically creates a widget container control, and then it passes the control to that widget container. So widget container will then take care of creating the presentation layer for the widget. So if you go to the widget container, so let's start with those events. So on pre-render is something that executes later. So on the page load, the first thing it does, it loads all these existing state. So it loads the title, then it loads the status of the buttons. So buttons like this button, whether it's edit button or it is in edit and close state. So it basically restores the widget state as it was. So if you had clicked this one, if you had clicked this one, so it needs to restore the exact state. So once that is done, then before page load fires, the on init fires first. So on the on init, it loads the actual widget control. So in the widget instance we have the widget and then the URL, and this URL points to a widget control inside the widgets folder. So on the widgets folder you have all these widgets. So either of this is loaded dynamically inside the body area. So inside the widget body panel it adds the widget that has been loaded dynamically. So on the UI you will see that this particular body area comes from a dynamic control, and that's it basically. Once the real widget control is loaded, it then takes care of rendering the presentation for this widget. So it takes care of loading the RSS feed and rendering it here, and it basically handles any event click that happens here. So that's the execution flow of the UI layer.